We'll make a start here in just a minute. If you could find your seats. Good evening and welcome to Regent College. I acknowledge as we begin tonight that we're located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. We're here at Regent College for the final evening of the three-part series of the Laing Lectures for 2024. And thank you so much for coming and joining with us. You seem to be having a very good time together here on the Regent campus. I also want to greet those of you who are with us on the live stream, wherever you may be and whatever time zone you may be in. Thanks for joining us. My name is Jeff Greenman. I'm the president of the college, and it's my real privilege to be the host and MC for tonight, and we look forward to a really wonderful evening. Regent is a place where we seek to think about the implications of the Christian faith for every area of life, and to pursue a faithful engagement with every area of culture that God calls his people into. And this lecture series this year is particularly apropos of some of the deep social issues that we are wrestling with as a society in Canada, certainly in the US, where our speaker comes from, and in many other places around the world. The situation of racial division, racism, and a quest for racial reconciliation. So it seems extremely timely and pertinent, and it certainly speaks well into an ongoing conversation we have around these things at Regent College. So a word about the Laing Lectures before I introduce our speaker. The Laing Lectures, this is our 25th anniversary. This series has been a great gift to us, and a gift from Roger and Carol Laing from Calgary, named in honor of Roger's father, who was a person who loved books and conversations and the opportunity to really engage on these big issues. So this series has done that for these last 25 years, how quickly it has all gone. And we're really grateful to Roger and Carol for their generous support for this endeavor. The very first Laing lecturer way back when was Neil Postman, a sociologist. Some of you know that name. Along the way, Peter Berger, a very eminent sociologist, was also in the series. So here we have another sociologist with us, and just a few logistical matters before I introduce him to you. One is that at the back, there is a little blue card. And if you're interested in receiving updates about things like when the Laing Lectures are happening via an email from us, we need you to give us permission to email you. Aren't you glad that there are very strict anti-spam laws in Canada? So we honor those. We cannot bombard you with unwanted emails that you cannot possibly ever unsubscribe to. No, we don't do that. So if you wanted to leave your information on the little blue card and leave it in the box at the back, that will give us permission to contact you with information about lectures like this and other things that you would opt into. So there's one thing I wanted to say. The other thing is that these lectures are being photographed, videoed, live streamed, and we're going to make them available, and the previous two nights' lectures are available on our YouTube channel. So you might want to catch up if you have missed one of those two sessions along the way, or refer them on to other people who might be interested in this content as well. And I need to say that by entering this location, you agree that Regent College has a right to use your likeness and image in marketing, advertisement, other promotional matters, and in the coverage of this on our website. So that's a disclaimer for your awareness. Be aware of that, and there's further details posted on the door about that policy. We're trying to uphold the Canadian very strict and very appropriate privacy laws. So tonight, after the lecture, you'll have an opportunity to interact with him further at the book table. So there's several of his books that are available, and we just have a new supply of Beyond Racial Division, a big stack of them. This is one that I want to particularly recommend because it really speaks to the content of really last night and tonight's lectures, and would be good for your further reflection, discussion with other people, and so on. So the book is there. So our speaker will be out there to meet with you and be glad to sign copies of these books. Authors always love signing copies of their books. That's a hint. So a reminder just to please turn off pagers, cell phones, other devices that would beep or otherwise make noises that could interrupt us, please. There's no audio or video recording of these lectures. We're doing that for you. And no flash photography. We have a couple of photographers who will be here doing their professional thing. So now it is my great pleasure to introduce you to Dr. George Yancey, who's been with us this week. We have thoroughly enjoyed his presence with us on campus and interacting in these lectures in the evenings, a noontime session primarily with our students, and then with our faculty in various ways. It's really been quite a delight to have him. Dr. Yancey grew up in San Diego, the place where there is never a bad weather day. That's probably spoiled you deeply in a lot of ways, hasn't it? Yes. He's professor of sociology at Baylor University in Texas, where he's also a professor in the Institute for the Study of Religion. He is married with 3 sons who are 8, 7, and 5. He is the coach of the 5-year-old's soccer team. Always a fascinating activity, that. I did that myself back in the day. And is an expert on a whole variety of topics as a sociologist. We don't have time to go through them all. He has a very long and impressive resume that details extensive publications and articles and many books, books of a scholarly nature and ones also like this one of a more general audience nature to help the rest of us who are not specialists to understand the fruit of his thinking. And he has given many years to thinking very carefully around these questions of race, racism, and racial reconciliation. He's also spent a lot of time thinking about the whole political divide situation that is occurring in the U.S. and also how that has many different dynamics to it. So he has so much to offer. These lectureships are designed to bring someone to us in the Regent community who will stretch us, who will challenge us, and who will offer some alternatives and ways forward for Christian people in the church to reckon with the cultural moment that we live in. That's what these lectures are designed for, and that's exactly what you're going to hear tonight, his lecture on the theology and sociology of conversation. So let's please join me in welcoming Dr. George Yancey.
Good evening once again. So last night we looked at 2 possible solutions, and being the sociologist who critiques everything, I say they don't work. So we should feel bad. Now, good news is I think there is a path forward. That's the good news. Bad news about that is the path forward is not going to be easy. It's going to cost us time, effort, ego, and it will take some time. And the way I see it, as you all just found out, I have very young boys. I don't know if we'll get there in my lifetime. I'm hoping we'll get there in their lifetime. But it's worth working towards that. So I want to discuss what I think is a better approach. And the monitor's not on up. The monitor's not on up here. So I don't know whether or not. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. All right. So I'll be looking back a little bit more now. All right. So I want to begin to build the framework by which we can understand the path forward, which I think is solid theologically and empirically. So to do that, yesterday we discussed perfectibility. And perfectibility, for those who weren't here, is the notion that we can create a society that is, we can perfect our societies, that humans will perfect themselves. It's the idea that developed in the Enlightenment thinking, and that was where they were centered. And what I argued is that both colorblindness and antiracism were built on the notion of perfectibility. You do what we ask, and we'll create this perfect society. But there's a biblical truth missing here that both approaches lack, and that is the notion of human depravity. If you were here yesterday, one thing I talked about how those with the more secular mindset have a high view of humans. And we Christians have a high view of humans for different reasons. Their high view was that we've evolved. Our high view is that we're image bearers. all right? But they both have high views. But what's lacking is that those who are secular don't appreciate human depravity. They have the high view, but they don't have the humbleness that comes with human depravity. And thus, they believe that we can create the perfect society from our own human ability. Human depravity says that that is not the case. So let's take a look at human depravity. And let's take a look at what it means in this current situation. Now, I stand here in a theological institution. I know talking about discussing human depravity from a sociologist, I may sound like some of you all discussing surveys to a sociologist. But I have my understanding of human depravity. And I always say that human depravity, when I begin to look at it, it has to start by looking at it within me. It doesn't start by looking at others, the people I don't like. It starts with me. And from there, I can work things through. All right. One of the things that human depravity teaches us is that humans are inherently selfish. We become very self-absorbed. If you remember, the idea behind perfectibility is that we can educate people to become a higher, better, more noble. But wherever you go, you still take yourself there. You still take that human depravity with better education. And education does not take away selfishness. There's a famous relationship between racism and education that sociologists will tell you, that the more educated people are, the less racist they are. And there's study after study that shows this. However we measure racism, the higher the education, the less racist people are. So a couple of colleagues of mine decided to really test this out. So they looked at a survey, and they looked at the survey looking at just whites, and the more educated whites were, the more likely they were to say that they would move into a neighborhood that had people of different races. Then they looked at another survey. And the more educated whites were, the more likely they were to say they would send their kids to an racially integrated school. But my friends didn't stop there. They looked at other data to see what whites actually did. And so what they found out was that the more educated whites were, the less likely they were to live in an integrated neighborhood. And the more educated whites were, the less likely they were to go send their kids to integrated school. Now, this was after a set of controls. So this was not, well, if you're more educated, you have more income, and that's why you go to live in a segregated neighborhood, because income actually washed out. So it wasn't about income, it was about education. And my friends concluded that education is not any sort of moral standing. In fact, they argued that when you become more educated, you know how to protect yourself. And the whites protect themselves by sending their kids to more racially homogeneous schools and living in homogeneous neighborhoods. And it brings up the question, what if education doesn't make you a more moral person? What if instead education teaches you how to hide your own depravity? Education does not make us more moral. You learn how society works, and you can work your way around society. And yet, those in perfectibility think that education can make us better people. So given all of this, given this dynamic, human depravity suggests that only by accounting for our own desires to protect our self-interests can we deal with group conflict. Because when we talk about race, we're talking about group conflict. We're talking about people who have different ideas about how racism works in our society, different solutions. And the way to deal with that conflict is, once again, I start with myself. I have to account for my own desire to protect my own self-interests. Now, it'd be nice if you could say, well, you're aware of this now, George, so good, and now we can not worry about it. The problem is, you can't trust me. I might think that, okay, I've accounted for my own self-interest, but dynamics of depravity, and if you're not comfortable with depravity, you can look at research on confirmation bias, that I'm likely to find solutions that help me. So how do we get around that? How do we count if you can't count on me? only holding each other accountable can we find solutions. So it can't be what I decide or what you decide. We each have to start strengthening each other and learning from each other. And this is part of what I'm talking about as to what our Christian faith suggests is a better approach. Not that me and my group say, here's the answers, you all need to accept our answers, but here's our answers, and we acknowledge because of depravity, our answers are incomplete. And if we work together, we might find more complete answers. In fact, we will find more complete answers. So I've called this a mutual accountability approach at times because the responsibility is mutual across racial lines. And I see it as a Christian-based approach where we recognize that people of all races have a sin nature that has to be accounted for. Thus, everybody has an obligation to work towards healthy interracial communication to solve racial problems. Now, I want to be very clear about this. And I hammer this quite a bit, that I don't care what your race is. You have an obligation to help create an atmosphere with healthy interracial communications. Doesn't matter. None of this is what whites are supposed to do, and this is what people of color are supposed to do. However, what I think is going to happen is those solutions are not going to be solutions where oftentimes the solution is the same across race. It may be sometimes. But with our history of racial abuse, at least some of the times the solutions are going to be, here's what whites need to do and here's what people of color need to do. The mutual part is creating the atmosphere to have those conversations. And if you impose a solution with those conversations, what you're going to guarantee is pushback. And guarantee that counter-protest. You tell people, no, you're going to do this, and they're not 8, 7, and 5, my kids' age, and even sometimes, especially if they're 8, 7, and 5, a lot of times they're going to say, no, you can't make me. And you can force me right now, but I'll find a way to seep around and sabotage you. All right, so let's break this down a little bit further. What are some of the foundations for a mutual accountability model? First foundation is no one has all the right answers. We have to come here thinking that we have, people who think they've got it all solved are the ones who are not ready for the conversation. And should we as Christians ever feel that we have figured it all out? And the older that we get, ideally, if we gain in wisdom, we realize just how little we have figured things out. Now, I think I have some good answers. I've studied this for years. You can talk being an African American, my experiences and look at the research, but I still don't have all the right answers. And I have to realize that. And sometimes there's things I need to learn. As fallen creatures, we need to listen to others to get better answers. So I don't have all the right answers. How can I get closer there? I may not get there completely. How can I get closer? I can listen to other people. Listening doesn't mean I have to agree with them, but I can learn and incorporate what is right in their answers into what I'm doing. And ideally, they're doing the same with me. This is how and there's research that shows that group decisions done correctly are almost always superior to individual decisions because you learn from multiple people. We listen to negotiate better solutions with those who disagree. So let's be honest. When we have these conversations, if we do it right, people are going to come in and they're going to disagree with each other. Getting people who already agree with everything, that's not very productive, and you're not going to go anywhere. How do we deal with people who disagree with us, who we think are totally wrong? Do we dismiss them, or do we listen to them and find where they are right and learn how to accommodate and bring them along? We strive for win-win solutions rather than win-lose. It is not in our interest for people to feel that they lost in our conversations. Because people feel that like they lost, then they have nothing to work for in making sure the solution succeeds. We want everyone to feel like they're getting something from the solution. What often happens is that the thing that I want the most, a lot of times when I'm in conversation, the other person can give up the least. They can give up the most. I say that bad. The thing that I want the most, a lot of times the other person, they value that less. And it's in their interest to give that up. And sometimes what they want is things that I don't value that highly. It's in my interest to give that up because now they're on board with me. We want win-win solutions. Think about it this way. What if you get 80% of what you want or 100% of what you want? Now everyone says, well, I want it all. But to get 100% of what you want, the other person has to feel like they lose. So you get 100% of what you want, and 40% of the country is going to sabotage you. It's going to fight against you. It's going to counter-protest. They may not be able to do it today, do it tomorrow, do it at the voting booth. Or you get 80%, and 80% of the country is going to be with you. There's going to always be some who's going to fight against you, but the vast majority is going to be with you. And what that 80% is usually most of what you want the most. Because in negotiations, you're going to give up what you don't want as much very readily, right? If it brings people on board. What is better? To have a stable, getting 80% of what you want, or get 100% and spend your time fighting to keep it? Because that's what we're doing right now. I described that cycle yesterday. In 2020, the anti-racists got a lot of times 100% of what they wanted. And it set up the counter-protests in 2021, 2022. And in some places, they're getting 100% of what they want. You know what? They're setting the seeds for the protesters going to displace them. And we go over and over and over and over again. We're all accountable for working with others and not just forcing our views on them. Okay, so when I looked at colorblindness and anti-racism, I also looked at research. So this is an argument. Is there research suggesting that this is a path forward? So let's look at some empirical work on healthy interracial relations. What do we know? One thing we know is under the right conditions, interracial contact helps to alleviate bias. Now, it's not a guarantee that you have contact with other people that bias is going to go away. There are certain conditions such as a feeling of equality and cooperation and things of this nature that has to be there. But it is well established that interracial contact under the right conditions means less bias. So what we don't need to do is to stay around people who we only agree with and the others do the same. We need to be in contact with one another. Having a common group identity increases positive feelings. So I've been using basketball examples. I've been told you all don't understand basketball that well. So I'm going to use a hockey example. The Canucks, right? Is it Vancouver Canucks? Yes. Okay, good. I wasn't sure. If one of you all come down to Texas and use hockey examples, I probably would, okay. So when you go to the Canuck game, does it really, you're with the fanatic Canuck fans. All of a sudden, all the difference between you don't matter, right? You have this common identity. You're the Canucks, and you're beating the Bruins, right? Is it Boston Bruins? Isn't that a hockey team? Oh, did something bad happen with them last year? 2 years ago, okay. All right, sorry about that. I should have said Dallas Stars. I do know about them. So you're there to beat the Dallas Stars, and you have a common identity that increases positive feelings. You feel positive with the people you're cheering with. When we feel like we have something in common, we have positive feelings towards one another. The more we emphasize what we have in common, the more positive feelings we have with people. So often in our discussions, we emphasize how we differ. And we have to just talk about how we differ. But we also have a lot of things in common. One of the things I try to do in my classes to really help my students to get along with each other is I try to give them something common. And that's why I give hard tests. So they all have fear of me. They don't realize it, but I'm doing them a favor. Families with a collaborative orientation have more positive interactions and relations with each other. Families learn how to collaborate together. Sometimes people ask me, well, how do you try to raise kids to do this sort of stuff? And I say, I'm an expert in sociology, but my fathering I'm not an expert in fathering. I'm still learning. But one of the things my wife and I are trying to do is teach our sons how to collaborate together. And so when they have a disagreement, rather than trying to fight to win, we're teaching them to figure out what the other kid wants, and is there a way in which they can negotiate it so everyone feels like they win. Now they're 8, 7, and 5, and so they're only collaborating so much. But we're seeing some bright spots. Every now and then they start fighting over a toy, and y'all know this. The kid's favorite toy is always the toy the other kid's playing with. And sometimes they go, okay, well, why don't we take turns? Set a timer so we can take turns. We're like, going, yes, they did it on their own. Because we want a collaborative orientation. Win-win. Work together. Collaborative communications in an atmosphere of mutual support creates volitional compliance. When you have collaborative communications, what happens is people feel like they've had their say, they have skin in the game, and they choose to work with you. When you force people to do things, and instead of choosing to work with you, they choose to fight you. So you decide which way you want to go. Do you want people to fight you, or do you want them to work with you? Now, I want to go back to the study discussed last night. I discussed what didn't work for companies that wanted to hire more managers of color. And you remember, those of you who are here, that mandatory diversity programs didn't work, grievance committees didn't work, job testing didn't work. Fortunately, and that was the bad news, fortunately there was good news. Like, one thing that worked was voluntary diversity training. Now you may wonder, well, voluntary, that means people don't have to go. And yes, people don't have to go. Why would that be better? Consider this. First off, if it's voluntary, who's going to be there? People who actually want to learn. I mean, tonight's voluntary. I don't know if there's a class that, hey, you have to sign this up in order to go. So you're here because you want to learn. And so you're going to learn more than if we force people in here. And also, if it's voluntary, what sort of training do we do when it's voluntary than when it's mandatory? It's going to be a different type of training. You see, there are diversity programs that do work. They may take extra effort. What we do know, for example, is that diversity training programs that encourage people to take the perspective of others have more powerful effects in changing people's attitudes. Diversity training programs that focus less on teaching and more on skill development are more effective. And so it was voluntary, but you're going to develop skills. And some of the skills I'm talking about are skills that don't just apply to racial issues, but could apply to your life, could actually help you in your family. People are going to want to come, and it's more effective. So voluntary programs actually create a better atmosphere. And 5 years later, there's more people of color as managers. Mentoring also matters. So you go to your managers there, and let's say they're mostly white, and go, you know what, can you help us mentor some of the new people we're hiring who are people of color? And they're going to want to impress it, it's part of their job, and so they're going to probably do that. And that mentoring helps to create an atmosphere where the managers of color are more likely to stay, and it also helps to bring buy-in to the current managers. Diversity task force. So what Dobbins and Calvich found out was that sometimes managers would go to, once again, the mostly white managers are already there, and they would say something to the effect of, well, you head up this diversity task force and help us to recruit more people of color as managers. And all the time the managers go, yes, it's part of my job. And so what they do is those managers then, it is in their interest to succeed. They want to impress their boss. And so they now try to find innovative ways to hire and retain managers of color. Along those same lines, diversity managers. If you don't have a total task force, you may assign a manager to say, hey, you're my diversity manager. So can you find ways to help us to recruit people of color and retain them? And once again, this tends to lead to more managers of color being hired. Now, I want you to note what's happening here. There are some common themes, especially with the last three. The key is you're going to the current managers and you're saying, can you help us? Whereas what we saw last night, you went to the current managers and said, you're going to do job testing. You're going to set up grievance committees. Hey, you got to go to this training. When you go to people to get buy-in, you create a more effective environment to recruit and retain people of color. When you go to your current managers and dictate to them what they have to do, you create an atmosphere where you have fewer people of color. Collaborative conversation is about going to people and working together and not dictating to people what they have to do. And that may feel like, oh, but shouldn't they do the right thing? Shouldn't we have to tell them what to do? And you may feel that, but that's not effective. So the question you have to ask is, do you want to do this that may make you feel a little bit better? Or do you actually want to do something that actually recruits people of color as managers? Because Dobbins and Kalbich have shown us techniques that is at least correlated to this recruitment of people of color as managers. This is the key to collaborative conversation, working together, finding ways in which you can find solutions. But if we do that, then some people may have bad ideas, and they may retain those bad ideas. How can we shake those bad ideas out of them? Well, we can learn from, once again, that fountain of wisdom, which is what? Social media, yes. So one thing that I've observed as a social scientist, of course, is that there are ways to win arguments in social media. And so by doing so, we can learn how we can win these arguments. For example, one of the ways to win arguments is with clever insults. You know, if you can figure out a way to insult people and people will go, ooh, that is a good way to win. I grew up playing something called the Dozens. And that is that I learned how to insult people very well. You know, didn't serve me well when I became a Christian, but still I have that. So learning how to insult people, how to make them look silly, that's a way to win social media. But it's not the only way. We can also put our opponent's position in the worst possible light. So if our opponent wants to restrict immigration, we call them a racist pig. If our opponent wants to have more expansive immigration, we call them a woke communist. We figure out the worst thing about our opponent we can, and we put it into their argument and to show just how awful they are so we can win arguments on social media. And this is a classic and one that I truly enjoy, where we get our opponent mad while keeping our own cool. If we can get them to go all caps, that works. You know, you can be back, sitting back going, dude, why'd you go all caps? You know, oh, you talking about my mother? Yes. You know, people can see how silly that person is, and they know that you won the argument. And then, of course, you must tag other people, especially people you don't agree with you, so they can come in and pile on that person. Because one thing is just you and one other person laugh at that person, but get to 5 people to laugh at that person, they should crown you right away if you can do that. So using techniques like this, you can win your arguments in social media. And we can see this all the time. So you win your arguments. Have you convinced anybody? Research says you probably didn't convince anyone. You have all the data, all the evidence. In fact, sometimes when you throw all that at people, they actually become more entrenched in their beliefs. But you know what? There are ways you can convince people. There's research on how we convince people. Now, if you want to convince, now, once again, if you want to win the argument, do what I did in that last slide. If you want to convince people, here's what research says. You build rapport. You find common grounds. Hey, man, the Canucks, yeah. You find something common. You build rapport. You build connection with people. You identify areas of agreement. If you're with someone who disagrees with you on everything, anything you bring up, why, I disagree. This is where the source of polarization comes. Where if one person says up, it's got to be down. Left, no, it's got to be right. Forward, no, it's got to be backwards. No, figure out where you agree with that person. Because once you have this agreement, then they know that, well, this person's on my side at least a little bit. And it gets them to saying, yes, I agree with that, which helps them say yes to other things later on. I know this one's painful. Admit when the opponent has a good point. Admit it. Let a person know, you know what, I've thought about what you said, and yeah, I can see that. That's a good point. I have to consider it. That lowers people's guards. Instead of attacking them and they have their guards up and they're thinking of the next counter, you have a good point. Oh, okay. Admit when others have a good point. Understand the opponent's arguments. Do not engage in what's been called straw manning. We create a straw man of an argument, put it in the worst possible light, and then tear it down and done something. Because all you've done is the person says, well, that's not what I believe anyways. So, you can attack that all you want, but that's not what I believe. Understand their argument. Do you understand their argument? Maybe you should ask them what their argument is. And sometimes look what the person wants beneath the surface. Sometimes the person needs acknowledgement that their pain is real. Sometimes the person wants to feel like they're valued. Not always. But sometimes there are things behind that. I'm reminded of a Facebook friend of mine told me of an experience he had. He is a Hispanic American and is active in the immigration front. And posted an article about the immigration situation. And he had a guy email him who was mad, and all things, you're coming over and taking our jobs, and da-da-da-da-da. And of course he felt offensive. But then he said, whoa, where's all this anger coming from? And they started emailing back and forth. Found out the man had just lost his father. And so he was angry over that. And I have no doubt that he had feelings about immigration. And over that, and now he sees this guy, with this article against what he believes in. And he took it out on him. And once he got through to that, he was able to have a real dialogue, and he led the man to the Lord. So sometimes the anger comes from a different place. Sometimes you want to, and sometimes I ask people, what are you hoping to accomplish through this? Because I really want to know, is there something you really try to, are you here to do is argue, or is there something beyond this that you want to try to accomplish? This is how we convince people. And here's the sad thing about us as Christians. Look at that list. How many of you have taken an evangelism class and learned something like this? So, for example, what if you try to evangelize people the same way you try to talk to them about racial issues? You probably sound like that street preacher who's telling them to turn and burn, right? Why do we think it's different on racial issues? That we can yell and cajole people, and then they're going to come to awareness that we're right. So we Christians, we actually know this. We just haven't been doing it. One of the ways I like to think about this is as we deal with race, if you think that your side is right, How do you deal with that? How do you build consensus? How do you get people to do what you want them to do? And so as I think about it, there's really two major ways in which we get people to do what we want them to do, and that's either through power or moral suasion. You know, power is we incentivize them or offer them negative sanctions. It could be financial, it could be cultural power, it could be physical power. There's a lot of ways in which you can use power. Moral suasion is when we persuade them morally of what to do. And some people will say, well, you know, we should never try to convince people. And I say, really? So your cousin has a drinking problem and needs to go seek help. Are you going to say, well, you know, I shouldn't tell that person what to do? Or someone's heavily, you know, you have an aunt heavily involved in QAnon. Or you have a sister who's being beaten by her boyfriend. I shouldn't tell them what to do. No. There are times in which we need to talk to people and try to persuade them to do something, right? Now, power is one mechanism. And at times, power is necessary. There are times in which we have to use power. When someone's robbed a bank, I want the police officers to arrest that person, to use the power to arrest that person. I don't want the police officers to try to convince them that bank robbing is wrong. You know, I have to use power raising my boys. You know, there are times in which we're trying to use moral suasion, but sometimes I have to use power. There'll be negative sanctions if you keep doing this. You know, let's clean up the room. Keep cleaning up the room. Stop hitting your brother. You know, there's going to be negative consequences. Power is sometimes necessary, all right? But it carries its serious shortcomings. You see, moral suasion, not power, is what produces lasting change. And one of the things with my boys is as they're young, I use a lot of power. And my hope is, as they grow older, I'm using less power and more moral suasion. Because as they're young, I'm just trying to control and keep them from destroying everything. But I want them to turn into fine men, and they have to be convinced. And I know that 18 is coming where they move out of the house and they can do whatever they want. And I have no more power. And if all I've done is power up to that point, then they go off and they do whatever they want. And it won't be pretty. Moral suasion is needed to produce lasting change. And, you know, the thing about power is that if you get what you want through power, that sets up a really dangerous situation because you're tempted to always use power to get what you want. Moral suasion builds community. Power builds compliance. So if we're trying to build a community together and we have disagreements, if we can engage in a system of moral suasion where we convince one another, work together, that strengthens the community when we come to a conclusion. But if what happens is they say, okay, we have this disagreement, you know what, here's what we're going to do. If you don't like it, tough. You can get compliance, but you tear down your community. Collaborative conversation is about using moral suasion instead of power. Collaborative conversation, we learn how to use moral suasion. It's not about, well, people just believe whatever they want to believe, and we just let it go. We want to work together. Maybe my beliefs changes, maybe your beliefs changes, but we do it in moral suasion. I'm not going to try to force you to believe certain things, but I want to engage in moral suasion. The techniques of persuasion I just talked about: build rapport, figure out what we agree, and then we have a good point. And you do the same for me, and I can change my perspective as well. That's what we should head towards, rather than power. Power is sometimes necessary, but all that's we rely upon. And you believe you're right. If you believe you're right and you use power, then to maintain things the way they are, you have to keep using power. And think about the consequences when a person feels like they have to have things a certain way, and they have to use their power to keep it a certain way. What sort of rights are we willing to violate when we believe that? Okay, so let's talk, in our closing minutes, let's talk a few practical steps about using this sort of approach. So let's say that we have a controversy in the community, because there's part of this that's simply about individual one-to-one. There's also part of this is how can we use it to solve a problem in our community. Well, there's certain steps that I argue that we would want to use. First thing we want to do is define the racial problem. What is the issue at hand? What you don't want to do is try to solve everything at once. And anyone who's been in a relationship knows where that goes. Let's solve it all tonight. No, please, no. Solve that problem. But there's other things I care about. You know what? That's fine. Solve that on a different day. Because once you learn how to do that, the first problem, then you can move to the next problem, and the next one, and the next one. We may never get to all of them, but at least we're beginning to go down the right path. And then argue you need to identify the critical core. What is it that we agree upon? Now, before we discuss, well, I don't see this, and I think you're wrong in this, let's discuss what we agree upon. Maybe what we agree upon is that, we care about, policing the community and making sure, criminals are caught. Maybe it's about, a curriculum, that we care that the curriculum is biblically based. What is it that we agree upon, the different parties? What can we agree upon? Let's figure that out. And then we try to recognize the racial cultural differences at play. Now, to do this, we have to engage in something known as active listening. And what active listening is not listening to argue. It's listening to comprehend. And if you want to engage in active listening, here's how you do it. When I did research on atheists, I went to where atheists were, and I interviewed the atheists. The atheists did not know I was a Christian. I did not tell them, because that's part of our research protocol. And the purpose of that, not that I was afraid of being a Christian, but so that I could get more honest answers from them. I did not want to argue with them. I wanted to understand them. So I would listen to them describe, what they hated about religion, or why they became an atheist, or why they don't have any doubts about it, or anything like that. And to make sure I understood, after I listened to them, I would come back and put what they said in my own words, and I would give it back to them. And then I came back with, did I capture how you feel about it? And then at that point, they could say, yeah, that's how I feel about it, or no, that's not how I feel about it. Here's what you're missing. What I wanted to do was that if I could articulate how they feel about it, then I know where they're coming from. We can do similar things in our conversations. And in fact, if you want to learn how to engage in active listening, here's a practice you can do. Find someone you disagree with on racial issues. Take that person out, buy them, a Coke or a tea or coffee, or even buy them lunch, and then say, I just want to understand where you're coming from. So I don't want to argue with you, but why do you feel the way you feel about the immigration? Why do you feel the way you feel about hate crimes legislation? Why do you feel the way you feel about whatever? And then listen. And then when you think that you understand why they feel the way they feel, say, here's what I hear you saying, and put in your own words. And then see if they say, yeah, you understand where I'm coming from. Or they say, here's what you got wrong. But that's a practice. Now, what would that do? That will help us to know how we can talk to others and listen to them in ways that we know where they're coming from. So when we try to address them, we're not doing a straw man. We're actually addressing what their concerns are. And that then leads to the next step, where we can develop ideas that address the concerns of the racial outgroup. What I suggest is you're going to have ideas that can address your own concerns. If you've listened well, you now know the concerns of the people you're talking with. Can you alter your ideas to where your concerns are mostly met, but their concerns are addressed? And can they do the same for you? So can you move together to find a consensus where, no, you don't get everything you want, but maybe you get a lot of what you want and you address their concerns so that now we can work together. What if, during all that counter-protests against no CRT in schools, that a group of parents, a group of school administrators sat down and the parents said, well, here's what we're concerned about the literature. And the administrators say, well, here's what we want to do. I'm betting that if they had done that, they probably could have found some sort of compromise. Maybe there's a book or two that, you take it out, you go, no, they have to have all the books. Why? There's 10 books you want to assign. And if you could get 8 of them in there and have the parents support you, isn't that better than keeping all 10 and having them protest you? Trying to get everything is part of what is ruining our race relations. Develop ideas that can address the concerns of the outgroup, which then allows us to work towards a solution that can be accepted by all. And all is probably too much. There's always people who are going to complain, but by most, because that's the solution that we can move forward on. That's the solution that builds community, that we begin to address our concerns. As I said, this is going to take time, in part because we haven't learned how to interact in this way. And it's going to take some of our ego. We have to take some of our ego away, realizing there are things we may have to learn. So collaborative conversation is not just about talking to feel good. It's about problem solving. It's about finding ways to solve problems that are enduring, that are sustainable, that we have buy-in. And in solving those problems, we get closer and closer towards dealing with the racial divide between us. And if we start doing this, starting with one problem with another, then it becomes a rhythm. It becomes a way in which we begin to live, instead of the sort of arguing back and forth to one another. Because the colorblind and the anti-racism have their camps. We need to find mechanisms and organizations that will start living this way. So we use those as examples. And then we can say, look, there's a better way. And some of y'all have asked what sort of research I'm doing. One of the things I'm doing is I'm trying to learn how to teach people how to do this and to document, does this really make a difference? And so I'm in somewhat the early stages of doing that, but that's going to be a long-term project of mine. Now, on a personal level, I think there's a certain lifestyle that comes out of this. So one of the things which, as you look around the room, is probably not a problem here, is to do this, you have to develop racially diverse social networks. There are places in the United States where almost everyone around you is of the same race. And so at that point, it may be difficult, but with the coming of the internet and our ability to social network that way, there's really no excuse for us not to have racially diverse social networks at this point of our history. How are we going to have conversations with people of different races if we're not around people of different races? But I don't think that's a problem for Regent. So let's go to the next phase of that. It's to seek out productive racial conversations. So when I was an undergrad, my best friend was a white guy. And we talked about everything. He was a Christian guy, I was a Christian guy, and we talked about politics, talked about girls, we talked about God, we talked about everything except race. Now, why didn't we talk about race? Was it that he didn't want to talk about it? You know, the reason why I didn't talk about race, because I didn't bring it up. It was really my responsibility. I know, looking back, that's not something that he's going to feel comfortable bringing up. You know, that he grew up in a mostly white community. It's not going to be something comfortable bringing up. He never said anything to me to discourage me from bringing it up. I just didn't do it. I was not proactive. That's on me. For this to work, we have to be proactive. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not saying, hi, I'm George. How do you feel about racial issues? Okay? You know, come on now. But when the opportunity comes up, we got to bring it up. You know, raising our boys is the same thing. It's funny how opportunities come up. My wife, who is a former high school English teacher, loves to read, and so she's reading my oldest boy a couple of years ago. She's reading Little House on the Prairie. You're thinking, Little House on the Prairie, what does it do with the race? It's a bunch of white people out in the desert somewhere. Well, there's one of these stories where the father of Little House on the Prairie is in this dance, is in blackface. So for her, she's reading to, I think it was 6 or 7, I forget whether it's 6 or 7, my 6 or 7-year-old son about this. And now, this is an opportunity for her to discuss what blackface is and why it's offensive. So that just came out of nowhere. Just came out of nowhere. She could have tried to brush it off. Oh, I don't want to discuss this. You know, he's not going to understand that. The opportunities will come up when you develop the relationships. So yes, I'm not saying that, you know, everyone you meet or an acquaintance, you know, you have to deal with racial issues and that sort of stuff. But I am saying that the opportunities will come up and then, you know, you deal with it. With a tender own arrogance, our conviction that we are right all the time. That's there. And it seeps in, and we have to have the self-awareness to say, oh, wow, I'm not really willing to listen to this person right now. Maybe I should listen and see what they have to say. I don't have to agree, but I have to listen to know where they're coming from. And they may have something right, and also I may learn something on how I can reach them. You know, when you listen to people, you learn how to reach them. I remember about 20 years ago, when I was talking I was invited to churches and conferences to talk about racial issues. And I instinctively knew that coming there, you know, being the angry black man and saying, you know, you all are trafficking in white supremacy and stuff, was not going to be very effective. So what I found out was I had also done some research that showed that among Christians, among white Christians especially, that race was more important who they dated than faith. In other words, they're more willing to date a white person who is not a Christian than a black person who was. And so when I said that, when I told them that, because I knew how much they cared about their kids finding a good Christian mate, they cared deeply about their kids. And I knew that they weren't overtly racist. So I knew among those parents that if they had a choice with their kid bringing home a black Christian or a white non-Christian, there's no choice. But when I told them that, you could hear a pin drop. And then I knew I had them. I knew that they were interested in what I had to say, because now it involved their family. What do people care about? You know, if we're arrogant and we're just trying to hear the sound of our voice go out, we're going to miss that. Commitment to finding compromise. Compromise has become such a dirty word in a polarized society. But think, what's the alternative? I don't compromise. I expect you to follow me 100%. I mean, is there an alternative to compromise? Now, are there things you don't compromise on? Yeah, I mean, we do have some core. But be careful not to make everything a core value that you can't compromise on. You know, then you're really just saying, I'm not going to compromise. But there may be things that you can't compromise on. But we have to work towards compromise unless we expect people to simply do what we ask them to do, and that's not going to work. So that is the solution that I propose, a cloud conversation. Obviously, there's more to it. There's techniques on active listening and effective communication. But this is the direction that we need to go. We need to be, as a church, a body that is learning how to have better communications and have better community. You know, being here in Canada reinforces what we know in the United States even more so, and that is we're in a post-Christian society. And you all have been in it longer than we in the United States. We in the United States have probably the past 10 years come to realize that. You all have been in it longer than that. And here's the thing about post-Christian society. People who are not Christians are not coming to our churches. They don't feel they need to come to our churches. They can do just fine without it. There's no cultural pressure to come to our churches. And they won't come unless we give them something they're not getting outside the churches. So, you know, they're not going to come to our churches to just hear someone talk and even get some wisdom, because they feel like they can get that on the college campus with their professor. But what if our churches actually deal with racial issues that in a productive way, they build community, that encourage conversation, that worked out solutions? I'm telling you right now, in the United States, half of the country would go, wow, I want some of that. There are some who are going to stay firm in colorblindness and anti-racism, but half the country would go, what's happening there? Maybe I need to go and learn from the church. And lest you say, well, this is you know, scripture, why, you know, we start using scripture, they're going to run away. These principles are also reinforced by academic research. And it's not, we have things that people who are not Christians can benefit from. Now, we hope they will become Christians as they learn from it. One of the best examples is the idea of forgiveness. That's a key part of our faith. But you don't have to be a Christian to benefit from forgiveness. Forgiveness helps to alleviate anger, helps to forestall depression. There's all sorts of research on the benefits of forgiveness. If we become a body that does this, and we see benefits on racial relationships, on racial healing, if you will, people who are not Christians will want some of that. And even they don't, you know, some of them will become Christians, some of them will not, but it'll change our status in a post-Christian society from, you know, those funny little Christians, let them go off and do their things, just don't mess with us, to they got something that I want. I got to figure out what that is. So for me, this is bigger than racial issues. In a post-Christian world, this is one of the ways, not the only one of the ways in which we can create a place for ourselves at the table and to have a voice in our society. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Now, I should have said at my introduction, which I failed to, how we're going to do this, which is we've got a good chunk of time for questions in the way we have these last few nights. There's microphones at the top of the stairs. And if you're in the live stream audience, we'd be glad to have your questions too. And the email address has been on your screen, which is questions@regent-college.edu. So if you do have questions, why don't we do what we did yesterday too? Stand up for 30 seconds and shake your limbs. I want to see limbs moving, blood flowing. Give you a chance. Turn around, touch your toes, reach for the sky. There you go. Reach for the sky. There you go.
Touchdown.
Okay, very good. The blood is flowing again. I've got a couple of things to start.
Okay.
So yeah, it strikes me that the principles you're talking about are so necessary in a divided situation, including the incredibly divided political situation. of your homeland. This is an important week in American politics. In terms of the work that you have done about the division between sort of red states and blue states and the ideological differences, would you say that these same principles really speak into the kinds of conversations that need to happen at that level as well?
Yeah, most definitely. In fact, I would argue that as hard as it is to do this on racial issues, it may even be harder in the United States on political issues. That there's a certain amount of dehumanizing that goes on from both sides to each other. So it's definitely something that we need to try to do. And it's almost ironic because I think it's almost easier to start on race and go to politics rather than the other way around. In fact, the best predictor of racial attitudes is political ideology that I can find, because political ideology is so epidemic throughout our society. So yeah, I definitely would like to see this happen.
So you're saying the best predictor of racial attitudes is political
ideology. Yeah, your general political ideology, whether you're conservative or liberal, is the best predictor of your racial attitudes. It's better predicted than race, than education, than any of the other factors that we put into our models. Yeah.
Interesting. I think, was there a question over on this side first, and then we'll go to this side?
Hi, Dr. Yancey. I apologize if this was covered last night. I wasn't able to make it to the lecture. But you had a quote that I really liked. You said, "Moral suasion builds community, power builds compliance." And I was thinking, it seems to me that our systems both in Canada and the US, as an American, have been largely built on power and compliance dynamics. And my understanding of critical race theory and anti-racism is that one of their primary aims is that recognition of where this power compliance dynamic has structured our society is a necessary starting point for conversation. Do you think it's necessary to establish agreement on what kind of organization we're dealing with, whether we have a community or have a power compliance situation, in order to start these conversations?
I don't think there has to be an agreement on that to have the conversations. I mean, I don't want to force an agreement on people. If people have a different perspective on the origins of power, we need to hear that perspective is and why they have that perspective. So, let's try to find agreement, but let's not try to force an agreement on something like that, so that people can come to the conclusions on their own, or maybe a slightly different conclusion than us, but be influenced by us through this sort of cloud conversation.
Great, thank you very much. Question up here.
Thank you very much for a hopeful presentation on having better conversations. As I was listening to you, I thought that there were some affinities between your position and what's called Christian realism. So skepticism about perfectibility, an emphasis on depravity, and an appreciation for proximate, gradual change for the better. But one way you seem to depart from a realist position is in how you see groups to do better than individuals. So at one point you said group decisions are better than individual ones. And I thought of Reinhold Niebuhr's book, Moral Man, Immoral Society. It seems like you almost have a reverse on that. It's the immoral individual, but the society is where we become more moral. So I wonder if you could say a word, maybe both to substantiate that claim that group decisions are better, and then I guess related to that, how do you account for the brutality of some social collectives?
Right, yeah. Group decisions are better if you have a situation where people can have a choice to impact the decision. So I think the situation you're talking about when you have groups do horrible things is usually there is either a dictator or an oligarchy, and they have the power, and then they use the larger group to control and to do awful things. So when I'm talking about group decisions, I'm talking about people of different perspectives able to come through and make decisions. And there is some, I would have to go and look it up, but there is some research showing that when you have diversity of opinions working together, you tend to have better decisions. So I think we're talking about something a little bit different. We're talking about how groups can do horrible things because they're bigger, but usually you still have that overarching ideology. And it could be anything. It could be Marxism. It could be Christianity, like the Crusades. It could be Islam. It could be atheism. That ideology that drives people to doing horrible things. Yeah.
Great, thanks. Was there someone else on the line over there, or am I? No, okay. So let me ask another one. I'm interested in kind of starting points, and you talked about your own college experience with this friend. You didn't raise issues of race.
Right.
It was kind of on you to do that. I'm just thinking about congregations, and there's some pastors here and other church leaders. What advice or insight would you give to pastors or church leaders in a context where they haven't been talking about race?
Yeah.
And maybe now they're just beginning to think that they should start to raise the question or pose it? What would you say about getting started in an environment where people haven't, in a sense, entered into the conversation yet?
So, each pastor ideally understands his or her congregation to a certain degree. So that would give you insight as to how to introduce the conversations on race. And so it may be that the way you do it is you insert it in sermons. Sermon on something else, you insert certain racial examples, and you start doing it that way. And then you work up to where you could have a whole sermon on this topic. Others may be able to go whole hog into it. So I would leave it to the pastor to understand their congregation. I would suggest that they may want to, talk one-on-one with the leadership, depending on how the church is organized, be it an elder board or leadership council or something like that, if they want to go in this direction. And I would also emphasize, as they discuss racial issues, learning how to love and care for others. It should be the sort of central point, because that's a very Christian concept. If you lead in with, here's what we need to do, then people who disagree with you are going to resist you. If you lead in with, we need to learn how to love others. How can we do that? I think that becomes more amenable to people, and it can challenge them to engage in self-reflection.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Question up here at this microphone.
I really appreciate just even the call to love one another, even to follow the fruit of the Spirit and make that the criteria for who you support publicly. I unwisely thought of giving up American and Canadian politics for Lent, but unfortunately I didn't, and I will return from this gathering and follow the results and the responses to the State of the Union address, as many of you will unwisely as well, to destroy almost completely some of the winsomeness and transactional and mutuality which you describe. So the question for me is, how do you reset completely conversations that completely lack civility, that are such silos, it's hard to interact with? Yeah. Much of the studies and the helpful studies were current, but some of them were 1990s, pre-COVID, pre-polarization, and frankly, pre-Trump. So how do you start? How do you crawl out of the crater of those kinds of conversations?
Yeah.
And begin again as Christians? And I thank you for your own integrity of winsomeness and invitation to love.
Yeah. Trust me, I ask that a lot of times in the United States, and that's why I say in many ways the politics is going to be harder. So how do you reset? Well, as I said, this is not going to happen soon. It's going to, and I think if we're going to change, it's going to be a grassroots movement. It's going to be a movement as different organizations engage in this and set templates for this, that we're going to see more and more examples and people are going to come into it. But that's going to take a long time. I don't see how we could have a massive political organization built on collab conversations as of today. I'm just being realistic. I don't like that, but I mean, that's not the answer I want to give, but it's the answer I feel I need to give. But if we can begin to be very intentional and tell people, look, we're going to try to solve problems by talking together. Now, there are a couple of organizations in the United States that are doing some of this. Better Angels is one, and I really appreciate that. I wish I could be more active with them, but I'm too busy doing other things right now. Better Angels is one that is actually trying to do this. And as I said, I'm trying to find out how I can teach people how to do this, because I'm hopeful that if I can figure out how to do this and then publish on this, that I can get a lot of, at least churches, interested in going this route, showing examples. So, as I said, I don't think it's going to happen in my lifetime. But I got 3 young boys, so I hope that by the time they're my age, that we've changed this dynamic in our society, racially and politically.
Thank you. Question over on this side? Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Yancey, for coming and for these talks over the last 3 nights. I'm wondering if we rely fully on moral suasion and voluntary participation, as you've outlined tonight, in the sort of collaborative conversations, I'm wondering how we engage people who don't see the issue as important at all, or who don't have the desire to learn. Right. Maybe another way of putting it is, does the voluntary approach work basically because of selection bias? Because you've got the people in the room who they want to work on these things anyway.
Yeah. Okay, good question. First, just a clarification. We can't totally rely on moral suasion because sometimes power is necessary. So I'm not saying we're relying on moral suasion and someone is overtly discriminating against people or something like that. So I just want to be clear on that. But you asked a really good question. So what I have realized is that not everyone's ready for the conversation. If someone's not ready for the conversation, don't bang your head against that. In other words, we go to people, I mean, in some ways it's like evangelism, right? There may be someone that you know is definitely not ready to be evangelized, and so you maintain that friendship and you hope it may come and you develop that relationship. And we do that with the people who are don't see that there's an issue at all or are so staunch in their ideas. But there are people who are ready for that conversation. And one of the things that happened to me after 2020, and I started talking more about this subject, is I had people who come to me and say, you know what, I saw George Floyd, and I knew that we had serious problems in our society. And so I joined this anti-racism organization, and after about 6 months, I knew that that wasn't the answer. And I'm frustrated because I don't know what the answer is. Those people are out there. And so we start with who we have. Because you don't want to waste energy trying to convince someone who cannot be convinced at this point in time. I'm not saying you cast them out and don't befriend them. You develop relationships because that may change. You start with who we have, and we begin to build from there. And sometimes, you know what? And sometimes you need to take a break. Sometimes you need to get off social media or get away and not think about these things for a little period of time so you don't get burned out. So that's how I see it. Is I don't feel like I have to convince everyone right now that this is the path. I want to work with the people who are at least open to accepting it, and those who are not, I say God be with you, and when we can still be friends, but obviously I'm not going to try to push something on them they're not ready to accept.
Great, thank you. Let's go up to the mic up here.
Yes, thank you. This question comes to us from our online audience, and multiple people have asked something around these lines. How would you say that critical race theory relates to what you yesterday described as anti-racism, and what, if anything, can we learn from critical race theory?
Okay, great question. So the way I like to put it is critical race theory is sort of the academic type of treatment, sort of like, as academics, we have these highfalutin ideas going around. Anti-racism is the praxis, the actual doing. They talk about critical race theory, but anti-racism is, what are we going to do? And so that's a way of understanding it. It's hard to conceptualize intellectual differences between the two. There may be differences of emphasis, but intellectual differences. It's hard for me to think about, this is in critical race theory, but not in anti-racism at all. So that's very hard to consider. And what's the second part of that question?
Is anything that we can learn from critical race theory?
Oh, yes. So here, what I would argue, and I said yesterday, sometimes I'm anti-racist. And what I think anti-racism and critical race theory bring us, the strong value they bring us, is that they give us eyes to see where racial problems are. They help us to see where privileges have emerged. They help us to see how institutions can be corrupted racially. They're very good at that. What they're not good at is finding solutions. But as far as finding the problems, I think that we have a lot to learn from them. And so when I'm trying to figure out what the problems are, I'm more anti-racist in that sense. We talked about colorblindness yesterday, but I'm also anti-racist. And, I'm biracial, I guess. That's the way it is. But yeah, so I think it's useful in that sense.
Yeah, thanks. Let's go up to this side.
Yes, you were talking about your friend in university, your best friend, and how you felt it was your responsibility to bring up the discussion about race. Yeah. And it kind of surprised me. I would have thought that it was his responsibility being a member of the dominant culture. And so for myself, being a member of the dominant culture, I was trying to think, or I want to ask, how does one leave space for that discussion? Because obviously it is probably something that's not easy to bring up.
Yeah. Okay, so one thing to consider is, this was decades ago. So consider this. This is the guy in Texas decades ago. He is pretty clueless on racial issues in ways that you're probably not. So for me to expect him to say, oh, George, are you having problems with racial, is not really realistic, given the context that he has. So it's my responsibility, if I'm struggling racially, and I did have some racial struggles at that point in time. If I'm struggling racially and I don't tell them, then I cannot expect him to read my mind. I have to say, you know what, man, I was frustrated because the other day, and this happened. Now, if I'd done that and he said, well, he blew it off, then it's his responsibility. But I can't blame him when I don't say anything. I think when you're talking about your situation, you're more aware of certain things, and so you may want to ask the questions, and that's acceptable. Find ways of asking the questions. But that's not fair for me to sort of blame him, given the situation that he was in. So I hope that clarifies why I think it was my responsibility to do it, and my failure to do it is why we didn't talk about racial issues.
Thank you very much. Question up here.
Dr. Yancey, thank you for your very helpful lecture tonight. My question really has two sides to it, and that is a lot of the polarization going on in the U.S. right now, they've shown, has to do with the echo chamber of certain forms of social media, because people get in these feedback loops and that kind of thing. And can you speak to that dynamic and what can be done to address the problematic side of social media, where people are isolated and hearing these kind of feedback loops? And then the other side of the question has to do with another form of collaboration. I really appreciate your emphasis on communication and collaboration, but where people are actually joining together in a common cause, not just common across the table in terms of communication, but in a common cause. So I was thinking about when I played sports in the early 70s, and the school, was completely integrated by that point. And our football team were all joined together in a common cause. So we lived, if you've seen the movie Remember the Titans, except we didn't win the state, championship. But we were all working together day after day after day to try to achieve something together. And so a lot of my close friends, were the people that I was in a common cause with. So I wonder if you've seen examples of that, where you do have communication, but but part of what's going on is people say, hey, let's work on this project in the city together. And I just wonder if you could address that.
Yeah, to your first question, the silos, I think that the natural thing with the algorithms and everything is that you're going to get fed more of what you already believe. And so you have to go out of your way to read things you disagree with. And so we should be doing that. We should read stuff we disagree with so that we know why we disagree with it and we can interact with it. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't do that because the easiest path is just to go along. I don't know if there's any other solution. I don't know if the government can or even they should, regulate that sort of thing. But just know that your ideas, if everyone around you agrees with you, chances are you all are wrong on something, because research shows that the more we're around people who agree with us, the more confident we have that we're right and everyone else is wrong. So be very wary if you don't have people in your life who disagree with you. As far as the example of research has shown that athletic teams actually do tend to have better racial attitudes, in part because of what you just described. Because when you are on the football field and you're throwing the ball to the receiver, you don't care whether that receiver is white or black or Hispanic or indigenous or anything. You're just glad you got 6 points. Is it 6 points in Canada? The touchdown? Okay.
Touchdowns are still 6 points.
Still 6 points, okay.
There's points for other strange things too, but we won't go into that.
Yeah, that's right.
Yep.
Yes. So you're just glad you got the points. And so you work together as a team. So that is a good example. There are other institutions where we've seen it. We've seen, like one example, Christian example is the Quania Farms, which was an interracial farms back in around the 70s or 80s. And people really learned how to get along, and you had less racial animosity, and because you had to work together in order to sort of survive. So I guess one of the ways we could improve race relations is get people on a plane, an interracial plane, and then strand them on a desert island somewhere, and so that they'll learn how to survive. And so maybe that's what we should start doing.
Possibly.
That's my solution.
Just in the interest of time, we're going to take 2 more questions, okay? So 1 and then 2 from that side. Is that all right? So go ahead.
Dr. Yancey, I appreciate you naming that this kind of solution takes a really long time. I think many of us wish that our churches and our institutions and our organizations could just get better right away. And it would be so nice if in real life these mutual obligation approaches, we could just solve a race problem in one conversation. That'd be so nice. Yeah. But so often what I see play out in real life is, there's people who are willing to have the conversation, they're willing to do the active listening, and perhaps on one side there's some really wonderful, well-meaning white brothers or sisters who are trying to learn. And then on the other side, you have people of color who have been carrying the burden for a long time, and it might be hard for them to be able to share all of their experience, and so the conversation just takes a long time. So, all to say, do you have any stories of a community where you've seen this at work and it's been encouraging? Maybe they haven't solved the problems, but you're seeing fruit.
Yeah. I think yesterday during the lunch I talked about the book More Than Equals, where they had, you may be familiar with it, Chris Rice led a group down to work with Spencer Perkins, and for a while things were going along, and then there was frustrations, and they had a time where a lot of the African Americans in the community began to complain, and so they just had this time, and the whites felt like, oh man, they don't want us. But they discovered that wasn't the case. It wasn't the case that they didn't want them, but they didn't want them to come and just have the sort of white savior type of mentality. They want to work together. They want the leadership roles to be shared. And that has been a long-term success. To the best of my knowledge, that community still exists. I don't know if you've heard of John Perkins, but Spencer Perkins was his son before Spencer Perkins died, unfortunately, at a young age. But that community is there, and it still exists, and they're still working through the racial issues other days. So there are victories. There's not enough of them. And I share your concerns. I wish this could happen overnight. I wish we could have one massive conversation and solve it, but I know that that's not going to happen. But in some ways, maybe part of the journey has to be long so that we can appreciate it and so that we can build depth. And that maybe if it was too short, it would be such a shallow foundation that it wouldn't last. I don't know. I'm not God. But maybe that's why this has to be a long journey. But unfortunately, that's the way I see it. Yeah.
Thank you. James, last question.
Oh, gosh. Dr. Yancey, I'm with you on wanting it to be different for the next generation. But as I work with them, something I encounter regularly is an expectation that they really will see it fixed. And I'm wondering how much eschatology is to come in this as well, and how much we actually won't see it completely fixed until Christ returns and deals with the brokenness once and for all.
Yeah, so I think with any problem, that's the issue, right? I mean, we are not going to get perfection this side of the grave. And we're to strive closer to that, knowing that we're never going to get there completely. So the fact that we can't get perfection doesn't mean that we don't try to strive towards it. And this is why I say, I don't, I hope I'm wrong, but I don't expect to see it while I'm alive. Because I want people to know that this is not going to happen overnight. I don't want people to just go, you know what, last year you did that talk, and I had a couple conversations, and yet they still don't trust me. Remember in talk I said, this is not going to happen overnight. And there's reasons why people of color are slow to trust. They've been bitten a lot of times. And sometimes, sometimes they dump on you and it's not fair. So I'm going to let some of the whites know. Sometimes you're going to get dumped on and it's not going to be fair because you didn't do that, okay? And sometimes you may get angry at people of color and it's not fair to them either. So we just have to know that we have to keep working at it. And maybe part of it is that we do it out of obedience and let God bring the results. And then maybe one day I'll wake up before I die and boy, we really have done it. But I don't expect it, and I think by not expecting it in my lifetime, it prepares me to do the long work. I'm just thinking about my boys. I just want them to have the benefits of this. Maybe not completely, but we got to do better than what we're doing.
On behalf of all of us, can I say thank you for tonight and for the stimulating, challenging, very practical talk that you've given us, and also for leaving us on a note of hope and, thinking about the next generation.
Thank you.
Together, let's thank Dr. Yancey for tonight. And thank all of you for coming, and thank all of you for joining us on the live stream as well. I'm going to escort Dr. Yancey out to the book table, where his books are on one table. There's also another table of books from other authors on related subjects that you might find interesting. Thanks for coming to the Laing Lectures, and look forward to seeing you next March. I think it's going to be March, for the Laing Lectures 2025. Thanks very much for joining us. God bless. Have a great evening.